All right, we are here. We are live. Welcome back to the Blue Star Lunch Hour. I am Joey Ikes. That guy, I'm getting good at this, which direction am I pointing thing, is John Owning. And we're going to talk about the Cowboys 2021 draft class. And this is it's a very interesting class, John.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a lot of very interesting, as there always is with the Cowboys and the draft in general, a lot of very interesting conversation, dialogue, etc., going on before the draft. What's the thing that you remember the most about the 2021 like pre-draft discourse?
Well, for me, it was being really focused on getting one of those two top cornerbacks, J.C. Horn or Patrick Surtain in the second. I think those were the two that I would say the majority almost, it seemed like, at least at the time, it seemed like it was a consensus that everybody wanted either Patrick Surtain or J.C. Horn. And there were little factions created that some people liked Horn better, some people liked Surtain. I think both of us were in the Surtain group.
Yes, absolutely.
And that he's made us look real smart.
Yeah.
And just an aside, one of the dumbest detractions from a prospect that I ever heard was when they were watching Patrick Surtain. They're like, "Oh yeah, his technique is good. He's really good, but he's just boring." And Jason Horn's a lot funner. It's like, what?
It's a corner, man. Like he's supposed to be boring.
Do they put fun points on the board?
Right.
I was so confused. But I thought that was really interesting. I was a huge fan of Patrick Surtain. I was really heartbroken is obviously like too exaggerative of a word, but I was a little bit heartbroken when the Denver Broncos took him. You know, that started my Denver Broncos beef.
Yep.
Not a fan of the old Broncos, but that was interesting. But I will say the thing that excited me was how the Cowboys maneuvered around the fact that they didn't have the top two cornerbacks available. And I think even though going into that draft, we thought that Micah Parsons was going to be a strict off-ball linebacker. And personally, I wasn't the biggest fan of that. The way that they maneuvered the draft made that kind of pick at the time, off-ball linebacker going number 12, made it much more palatable because of the trade down and the other things they were able to do. So it was a very interesting draft. And I got to say, it was one of the more exciting drafts in recent history, at least from in my head, from what I remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on the Micah Parsons pick, and so we'll kind of get started with the Cowboys class. And yes, as you said, I was a big Patrick Surtain guy. There are some of these prospects where the evaluation is just relatively easy, where and it was kind of this way with TJ Watt too. And I'm trying. There we go. Let's make it. I'll see it. It was kind of this way with TJ Watt when he came out too, where it's like you have family bloodlines that make you think that like he's got what it takes to be an NFL player. He played at a really high level in college football. He did his job, what he was asked, incredibly well. Surtain was a freshman starter for Nick Saban, which at the time was like an unseen thing that almost never happened. There were just all these things that lined up to him. He was going to be a really, really, really good NFL player. And like you said, he has made us look really smart. The guy who the Cowboys picked in the first round. So as you said, J.C. Horn went, I believe, 8th overall to the Panthers. Patrick Surtain went 9th overall to the Broncos. And the Cowboys held the 10th overall pick that year, I believe. And then they wound up trading with the Eagles back to the number 12 pick. The Eagles came up and picked Devonta Smith. The Cowboys bumped back to 12 and took Micah Parsons. And like you said, there was a lot of questions about the Micah Parsons pick. For one, because the Cowboys just a couple of years before had spent a first-round pick on an off-ball linebacker.
Mm-hmm.
And then they come in and they pick this guy who hasn't played very much off-ball linebacker. Didn't look like that great of an off-ball linebacker at Penn State and had set out the year before due to the pandemic. And, he had every right to do that, just like he has every right not to come to the OTAs and all that kind of stuff. But it just created a lot of questions that it felt like at the time didn't need to be there. And then I distinctly remember draft night of 2021 because I remember in the post-draft press conference, they said something about him being a pressure player. And this was also Dan Quinn's first year coming in as defensive coordinator, so we didn't really know what that defense was going to look like. And then I remember starting to think about the idea of what about Micah Parsons as a comp to like a Vic Beasley type? All these defensive schemes have nicknames for these, kind of edge rusher. This, kind of weak side defensive end that's uber athletic, that, does a lot of different things and really is primarily like a downhill forward going player. And when I went back to that later that night of draft night and watched Micah Parsons with that eye after they had mentioned him as a pressure player. And it really sort of unlocked something for me that I didn't think that he had the football instincts in terms of reading keys and diagnosing and going and getting the football as an off-ball linebacker. And I think, to be fair to you and to me and to all the other folks who felt like that, I don't think the tape at off-ball linebacker in the NFL has been very good. And part of that is he hasn't done a whole lot of it, and so he hasn't developed at it. But they've given him the opportunity several times, and he hasn't really played all that well as an off-ball linebacker. So,
and I think it deserves to be stated too how difficult it is to play off-ball linebacker in today's NFL. Offensive coordinators basically over the last decade or so are really picking on the off-ball linebackers with RPOs, with all of these zone reads, all of these, putting them in conflict, play action. They're putting them in conflict every single play where they have run and pass responsibilities that are making life extremely difficult. That's why you only see the Fred Warners of the world, the Roquan Smiths, the really top of the top are the only ones making that, game-changing impact. Outside of them, you're kind of just, you have above that. There's obviously differences in the rest of the players, but they just don't make the game-changing impacts that you see players at a wider variety of players making at other positions.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this when we get into some of our film reviews and scheme-focused stuff over the next few weeks. But the thing about a linebacker or really any second-level defender is they are close enough to the ball that that they don't have the liberty to hesitate at all. They're so close to the ball that if they don't read it go, they're going to be late. They're going to not get to their gap. They're going to not get to their coverage assignment, whatever. But because of that, they are also far enough off the ball that you can manipulate them one way or the other. And so they have become targets for these offensive coordinators, like you said. And so taking an off-ball linebacker that high, then, one that didn't necessarily look like he had the greatest diagnose, read, and go get it type of skills was questionable. And then I think it was week 2, DeMarcus Lawrence broke his foot in practice after week 1. And I think Randy Gregory was sick too that week. There was 3 injuries at defensive end. And they all kind of looked around and kind of said, all right, I guess Mike is playing defensive end. And I don't remember the specific stats, but he gave that poor right tackle for the Chargers.
The rest is history.
Yes, nightmares. And he has been an all-pro since. He's been amazing. 3 Pro Bowlers, 2 first-team All-Pros, something like 50 sacks or something like that in 3 seasons. I don't have it right here in front of me, obviously, but just a remarkable career so far for Micah Parsons, one that has created this conversation that says, hey, at some point, Micah Parsons is going to be the highest paid non-quarterback in the NFL, and nobody's really going to think anything of it. And so here we are, going into year 4. And Micah Parsons is the best player on the Cowboys team, maybe? Outside of Dak. I would say Dak is a better player because he's the quarterback. His job is more difficult. He is up there in the upper echelon of those guys. More valuable for sure. But he's the best player on their defense for sure. And so that's pretty remarkable. And that's exactly what you need when you get your highest draft pick in, at that point of 5 or 6 years. That's what you need. You need these difference-making defensive players who play premium positions or difference-making offensive players who play premium positions. That's what you need up there in those top picks. And that they were able to do that and turn it into an extra third-round pick, right? Is that the way it worked out, I think? For that two pick drop that they made from 10 to 12 and still got their guy. So I think the Micah Parsons conversation deals a lot more with what was going on, pre-draft and immediately after the draft, and how much maybe that, that confluence of events with DeMarcus Lawrence getting hurt and Randy Gregory being hurt or sick or one of the two, and a couple other things going on that caused them to have to put him on the edge for that game. And the way he played in that game, and all of a sudden everybody just realized, like, okay, this dude is an edge. And there's been some people who have tried to say, oh, he needs to play off the ball to save his body and all this kind of stuff. I think if Micah Parsons is not playing edge, I think Micah Parsons needs to be resting, not playing linebacker. But that's my perspective on it.
Yeah, and I don't think Micah Parsons gets enough credit. I mean, if you look at how the Cowboys defense performed in the the 3 to 5 years before he got there, and the 3 years that he's played since, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg argument between him and Dan Quinn, who's more responsible for the defense's ascension. And I think they're both really responsible, but Micah Parsons' impact can not be really understated in the defense. He makes things easier on everybody else. I mean, there's a reason why I think DeMarcus Lawrence is having some of his most impactful seasons the last couple of seasons, with Micah Parsons opposite of him. Before Micah Parsons got here, I know this because I'm a huge Tank Lawrence fan. He was one of the most doubled edge defenders in the entire league. He was consistently up in the upper quartile of double team, with the TJ Watts of the world, with Myles Garrett's of the world. He was getting double teamed at similar rates as those guys because everybody knew that DeMarcus Lawrence is the one guy on that defensive line that you have to stop.
Yep, absolutely.
And then since you bring in Micah Parsons, he's not getting double teamed. He's still getting double teamed quite a bit, especially for a number 2 edge. I think I checked it at the end of last season. I think he was like top 3 among, number 2 edge defenders in double team rate. So he still gets that respect, but it's significantly less than he was getting before Micah Parsons got there. And it's allowed him to flourish both against the run and the pass. So I think Parsons's presence has been extremely beneficial for many people along that offensive front or defensive front. My apologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something that happens with both sides of the ball when you have that guy at the top of the depth chart and the trickle down effect of that. And that's what I always talk about, how if you want to improve your depth, you improve it from the top of the depth chart, not the bottom of the depth chart. Because if you just added, a third edge rusher to become defensive end 3, and Tank Lawrence was still your first defensive end, that's not changing the dynamic of your defense really at all. But you add a Micah Parsons, you make DeMarcus Lawrence your edge 2. Now, like, you're really cooking with a situation that creates advantages for everybody else across the front, and it creates advantages in coverage because you have the guys that you have up front. You can be really simple in coverage, as the Cowboys have been over the last few years, because you have the ability to get after people. Now, it creates some problems when you get towards the end of the year, and we've heard Micah talk about how worn down he has gotten towards the end of these seasons the last few years. And I think there's some conversation to be had about that. But now luckily he's one of these kind of more veteran players that maybe you can pull the reins on a little bit more early in the season. But yeah, so they take Micah Parsons, really change the dynamic of the overall defense.
And one thing we haven't touched on, there was a little bit of controversy when they took Micah Parsons because a lot of people wanted Rashawn Slater, who's also been a very good tackle.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's one of those things where it would have been really, really difficult. The top of this 2021 class is going to wind up being remembered as one of those drafts, right? Where we've talked about Pat Surtain already. There's Rashawn Slater. Devonta Smith just got a big extension. Micah Parsons is who Micah Parsons is. J.C. Horn has been hurt, but he's been good when he's played. And then there's a bunch of other guys at the top of that draft too, that it's going to wind up being remembered as one of those drafts. And like that top 15 players or something like that in that draft, it's going to be looked back upon that if you missed in the top 15 of the 2021 draft, it's a lot like picking like Nate Solder in the 2011 draft with all these other guys.
Yeah, I mean, you got guys like Jamar Chase, Jalen Waddle, Penei
Exactly.
Sewell.
Yes.
Yeah, like we said, Micah, Devontae, Rashawn Slater, Jalen Phillips, tons of talent all up and down.
Just dudes all through that top 15 of that draft that if you picked the wrong guy up there, you're in some trouble because it's going to hurt comparatively to the rest of the league. But then the Cowboys get into the second round, and we all went into the first round thinking they're going to try to take a corner, they're going to move around, do what they need to do to take a corner, and then they get into the second round, and we get the Blue Star Special here. There's two versions of those in the draft in the second round. One is the guy who's been hurt, and one is the guy who has some character concerns that some other guys are worried about taking. And that's Kelvin Joseph in the 44th overall pick there. And Kelvin was kind of a guy who not a lot of people were talking about early in the process because he didn't play a lot of college ball. But then he, has a pretty good final season. And, we talked about Devonta Smith going 10th overall. He had a really great game against Devonta Smith at Kentucky last year.
That was the big one. That was the
game that kind of like set everybody like, oh, this dude can play. This dude, And so a lot of people thought, hey, this guy might be a first-round corner. The Cowboys pick him at 44th overall. And here we go with our typical post-draft discourse of the Cowboys picked a first-round corner at 44 overall. And they had just picked Trevon Diggs the year before in a relatively similar situation. And he had a pretty good rookie year. He hadn't had his big breakout yet, but had a pretty good rookie season. And then the Cowboys picked Kelvin Joseph. And we're like, hey, the Cowboys have their two corners, back-to-back drafts, second round, didn't have to, commit a top 10 or 15 pick to it. And, congratulations to them. They're in great shape. Now, here we are going into the fourth year of what would have been Kelvin Joseph's rookie contract. And he was never really able outside of injury situations, able to push himself up into, any sort of meaningful role on this team, and wound up in his third year with the same defensive coordinator, same VP of personnel, same GM head coach who are all in place when they drafted him. He gets traded for somebody who's essentially an outcast or a cast-off from another team in Noah Benogany. And so, it's hard to think about a guy who we thought could be so much, who wound up just not playing well enough. And it's, I don't specifically remember. I'm sure we could go back and dig up news stories. Maybe there's a couple. Oh, well, there was the nightclub incident where some folks from his group or whatever were involved in an incident in a nightclub, and there was all that kind of stuff. But there weren't a ton of these off-field things. We didn't hear anything necessarily, or I didn't hear anything about him, off the field causing problems in the locker room or anything like that. He just wasn't good enough. He got opportunities. He was okay in his first year, had to play a little bit, but then in that second year, got a couple of opportunities and looked really bad at the end to the point where they wound up benching him and signing corners off the street and playing other guys in different places to replace him because they couldn't count on him. And that's rough from a top 50, top 45 pick.
Yeah, totally agree. I think the biggest thing looking back was the biggest mistake it was a really bad scheme fit. Dan Quinn was one of the guys who played a ton of man coverage, loves to play press. You see that with Trevon Diggs. You see that with Deron Bland. They love to get up in the guy's face, disrupt and then play that kind of silo coverage and that cover 3, cover 1 kind of family of coverages. But when you go back and you look at Kelvin Joseph, he was playing a ton of off. He was playing a ton of quarters. He was in those Alabama games, all of his 3, I think he had 3 balls thrown his way, and a couple of them were deep passes, but he was playing off and not 5 yards off. He was playing 8, 9 yards off. And I think that allowed him to see things better. It allowed his athleticism to be more proactive because he didn't have to be reactive at the line of scrimmage. He wasn't put behind the 8 ball immediately. Allowed him to use his athleticism more proactively in those situations. So I just think he wasn't a great fit for Dan Quinn's scheme. I think they saw the athleticism. They saw kind of, the play demeanor, because he kind of plays like a man cover, like his demeanor is kind of like a man press man guy, but he doesn't actually play that way in reality. So I think they thought like, okay, yeah, he'll be able to transition into this scheme. Effectively. Dan Quinn's really good at teaching. Joe Witt Jr. is one of the top defensive back teachers. We know what Al Harris has done, and that's when he came into. So it's not like that Kelvin Joseph didn't have good enough tutelage with the Cowboys to do it. I just think his skill set just didn't fit what Dan Quinn really wanted to do, and that forced him to be behind the 8 ball, and it didn't really allow him to play well or to take a hold of a roster spot really strongly or a starting spot. So it just kind of all devolved from there.
Yeah, and it's a great point that you make about the scheme fit. And this is one of those things that can wind up happening when you have a need on your roster like the Cowboys had at corner going into that season, and you don't address that need early in the draft and by early, I mean really with your first pick, is that by the time you get to the second round especially, these guys have some limitations or lacks of experience or things like that make this scheme fit conversation very, very important. And if you don't take that into consideration, this is what can happen. You can take a guy and he doesn't fit what you want to do. And, I don't know, Kelvin, I've never spoken to him, but I would be sure that you go into one of these situations, you go in your first year or two of the league and you don't have the start to your career you want. Like, that's a really hard mental thing to have to overcome. And for a guy like him, a guy that played the way that he played, and a guy who carried himself the way that he carried himself on the field, that confidence is really, really important.
And especially, we don't talk about this a ton, but the Cowboys are America's team. They're the most popular team in the world for a reason, and that comes with more scrutiny. I think we see it year in and year out that the Cowboys' draft picks get a lot more scrutiny than we see for most teams. There's a couple of teams that you see them get their draft picks get scrutinized the same level, but the Cowboys, most second round corners, I feel like the average fan doesn't really know, but people know about, Kelvin Joseph. They know about these guys, and it becomes obvious when they're not playing well. It becomes topics on like First Take and stuff. Like, these become big topics, and these become, things that are taught. And when you're young and you're trying to develop and it's not really going your way, it can kind of compound, and it can kind of make things even more difficult. And if you're not, that special, you don't have that special type of mentality, that special type of mental toughness, it's going to be difficult. And you see a lot of guys, it kind of hinders their development.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kelvin, I don't even know, he may not even be on the Dolphins roster anymore, but not with the Cowboys anymore.
I know the guy they traded him for ain't on the Cowboys roster.
Right. So it's
Commanders.
Yeah. So it tells you a lot about where how much they thought of Kelvin Joseph coming out.
Just aside, the Cowboys do an awful job of these player for player trades of draft picks that they don't really value. I mean, we can go back to like even the Alan Ball days, to the Houston Texans, Charvarius Ward. The Cowboys have, I feel like, made quite a few of these trades where they trade like a mid-round pick that's not really working out for them for like a mid-round pick that's not really working out for another team. And it seems like the Cowboys always get the short end of the stick. Obviously, I don't think that was the case here, but it's just always funny to me about how the Cowboys have made so many of these player for player trades that kind of ended up on the lesser end of it.
Yeah, that Charvarius Ward one was so hard because they were dealing with so many problems on the interior of the offensive line. They had some depth at corner. They're like, hey, we got this undrafted free agent. He's going to have a tough time making our team over the course of the next couple of years. Let's trade him and get this offensive lineman we think can play. And, it'll help our roster for this season. And, Charvarius Ward goes on as like multi-time Pro Bowler, like number one corner level player when the Cowboys dealt with a bunch of corner problems over the last several years. And Parker Ellinger is, I don't even think he's in the league anymore.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the Kelvin Joseph pick clearly didn't work out from the beginning. It really didn't work, and I think the scheme fit part of it is a big part of the reason. You mentioned that, and I'm glad you did. Then we get to the guy who maybe made the most like immediate, like, okay, this guy can really get it impact of this team, of this draft class, even training camp and, preseason, first game of the year, that kind of stuff. And that's Osa Digizua. And he is,
Hell yeah.
he third round pick, number 75 overall. And he has kind of become the stalwart of the interior offensive or defensive line for the Cowboys over the course of the last couple of years. And he's been phenomenal. He's a tier down, I think, in terms of like priority and importance and dollars and all this other kind of stuff from the Micahs and the CDs and the DAX, of course. But he's a guy who's going to be really important for them to think about getting the contract done with over the course of the next couple of years, or over the course of really this year, because this is exactly the kind of player that the Cowboys have failed to re-sign during this offseason, that they wind up having to use a franchise tag on at the end of next year, in the next offseason, where he's going into his fourth season. He's been pretty good, but they're not 100% sure. Like, do we really want to commit to this guy? Then he goes out and has a really good fourth year, and then they have to franchise tag him, and they have to way overpay, and they make him into a top 5 cost player for themselves. And then, you wind up with, Dalton Schultz goes on to the Texans and, takes like basically a middle of the tight end market deal after the Cowboys paid him like a top 3 or 4 tight end the year before. This is the kind of player that I talk about all the time, that get these deals done early. Like the elite ones, yes, of course, but get Osa done early, because even if it's sort of similar to the Terrence Steele and the Terrence Steele contract, we'll see how that ages. But the Terrence Steele contract was a really good call to do that contract when they did. They didn't have to go through the restricted free agency, the franchise, they didn't have to go through all that. This offseason, this training camp time is when you can do a contract with Osa and avoid all of the, hey, he's a franchise tag player now, because the Cowboys like to franchise tag these sort of upper middle class players. And now we've got to go through all this contract drama with him when we didn't have to do that. But Osa's been great. Like, he's really been the stalwart of that interior defensive line.
Yeah, I mean, looking back, this was my favorite pick at the time of the draft class. I was a huge 0097 fan coming out. He was really miscast at UCLA. He was playing a ton of like 2-eye, 4-eye. You'd even see him play some 1 and some nose at UCLA. And you just saw the thing that obviously anybody that knows me will laugh, and they know this. The first thing that sold me on him is the wrestling background. He was like a 4-time state champion wrestler in high school or something like that. And you saw his ability to play with leverage. You saw the quickness. You saw the flashes. I think he was one of those types that he was playing so much head up and on the inside shade of guys that it really hindered his pass rush performance. Like, if you look back at his pass rush metrics coming out, they weren't that exciting. But one of the fun things that we do at PFF is we do these things called true pass sets, where you take away, times where they're lying head up, or when they're in non-advantageous pass rush situations where they're not getting double teamed, there's no play actions, there's no screens, all of those type of things. And he was actually at the top of the draft class when you isolated those type of pass rushes. And I think that really really identified what he was coming out, as a prospect. He was extremely quick, really powerful for his size. He's an undersized defensive tackle, but his ability to play with leverage, his ability to play above his weight class with strength, his temperament, everything. He was just someone who I thought fit in perfectly with that Dan Quinn scheme at that 3 technique get up field. And I think that's exactly what he's done since he's gotten with the Cowboys. And one of the best things about him is you've seen notable improvements from him year over year. He hasn't taken a step back yet. And I think that's a very good indication that he's going to continue. And as we see, in the offseason, you see all these, all of our great analytics trends are posting these graphs, where like the X is like pass rush and the Y is like run stops. And you see, this is where Aaron Donald, Dexter Lawrence, all these different types of, tier 1 elite defensive tackles are located, and he's just right outside that tier.
Yep.
But if he continues the ascension that he's at, by year 4, 5, 6, he's going to be in that company. Now, I don't think he's ever going to be, the generational Chris Jones type of a guy, but I can see him, being that tier 1, tier 2-ish, still great, but just not the quite elite under tackle or defensive tackle guy, but he's going to be right below them. And that's extremely, extremely valuable for a defense, especially, people don't talk about it with Zim's defense, but the 3 technique is still an extremely important position in his defense. And I think Osa Odigizua is going to fit in extremely well.
Yeah, totally. And I think that he's always going to kind of live in the shadow of Micah Parsons from, he's never going to be recognized like Aaron Donald or Chris Jones or Dexter Lawrence or any of these guys like that who are the guy on their defensive line and play interior. Because they have Micah there, right? And even right now, they've got DeMarcus Lawrence on the other side, and all that. They got a first-round pick playing. It's going to try to play nose tackle for him. So he's never really going to get that big notoriety. But like you said, such an important role in any even front defense. In any defense where the guy that plays over the guard is really important. Just like in general, whether he's playing head up on the guard, whether he's playing outside or inside of the guard, he's a really important player. And this guy is playing and just living in the B gap and just making life really, really tough for their opponents on a down in, down out basis. Super valuable, awesome use of a 3rd round pick for a team that has burned some 3rd round picks with tossed them into the sun a few times. We're going to see one of those coming up here in a minute, I think. Then we have Chauncey Golston. We've talked about Chauncey a decent amount going into this season because we feel like he's one of these guys that kind of has a lot in flux with this defensive coordinator change. And part of that is, the lack of a real defined position that he's had over the course of the last few years.
Getting Tyron Crawford.
Yes, sort of, yeah. In that same, and I think I wouldn't be shocked if they even had the same idea with Tyrone Crawford, with Chauncey Golston as they did Tyrone Crawford, of just like, hey, and to be fair, that's a really important, really valuable player to have, right? Like, we've got injuries at defensive end. All right, he can go play defensive end. He's not going to, wreck games as a pass rusher, but he can eat some snaps. He can eat some innings for us. He's going to play well against the run, all that kind of stuff. Oh, we got some injuries at defensive tackle. All right, he can move inside. He can play on the interior. He's not going to be the best run defender we have on the interior, but he's going to give us a little bit of pass rush and quickness on the inside, and he's going to be all right. That's a pretty valuable player to have when you want to play all these different fronts and when you want to, when you have an undersized edge who, sometimes he's going to move to a linebacker, sometimes, all this kind of stuff. Like having these guys who can move all over the front is pretty darn valuable. And that's really what Chauncey's been. And I'm very curious to see, and I think that you agree with me that there's some fit here with Zim, with Golston, that maybe hadn't been there with Quinn, as funny as it is, with Quinn having drafted him, just in terms of, Zim likes these guys a little bit bigger, especially on the edge.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about Golston's skill set. I think he's kind of an interesting player because he's on the edge. He's a really solid run defender. He sets the edge well. He has the length and the strength and the leverage to be able to hold his own against tackles on the edge and stuff like that, but he just doesn't have the quickness or the hand technique ability to win consistently as a pass rusher on the edge. But then when you move him inside, it's kind of the inverse. He's not as good against the run because he doesn't have the size and the anchor to really hold up against double teams. I mean, unfortunately, there were more than a handful of snaps last year where he was getting moved, almost zip codes by double teams last year, which was unfortunate. But then you see him as a pass rusher from the interior, and he gives guards a lot of trouble because he has more quickness than your typical guard. He's able to threaten both sides. He's able to use those stutter steps and those club moves and to be able to slide into a gap, to be able to slide out of a gap, those type of things. And he does those really well. So you see his pass rush metrics really stand out when he's aligned in the interior. And I think it's just going to be interesting to see how Zim is going to have him fit. Is he going to be in that Scott Crichton role where he plays base defensive end in kind of, run situations before reducing down to, a 3 technique type role on pass rush situations when he's in the game? I can see that happening, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I'm excited to see how Zim's gonna fit him in, because even though I think Dan Quinn does a really good job curtailing his scheme to his players' skill sets, I think Mike Zimmer's a much more creative schemer, and I think he's going to create a lot more different situations that can allow Chauncey Goldston to be more successful.
Scott Crichton, that is a name. That was quite the pull right there.
Oregon State's own.
That was impressive. I was a big Scott Crichton fan coming out of the draft. So we get through. We have one more third-round pick here, and this is Nahshon Wright. And it feels like they did this every year that Dan Quinn was here, where they, made some sort of a move.
The long corner that no one thought deserved to go here.
Yeah, the guy they pick in the top 100 that, Dane Brugler or, PFF or whoever has like 215th on their overall board, and everybody kind of looks around after the pick and says, well, I guess Dan Quinn has a type. Like, okay. And it also feels like every year they give like a third or fourth round pick to the defensive coordinator to just light on fire.
Yeah.
And so Nahshon Wright was a relatively limited corner coming out of school.
That's putting it nicely.
I'm trying to be kind here. Limited player coming out of Oregon State. Speaking of Oregon State with Scott Crichton, limited guy comes in, and in this time of year, he's one of the cautionary tales of this time of year, right? Makes some noise during this time of year, because when you can't be physical, when you can only run, when you're only running certain things and you're doing installs and stuff like that, a guy that's that big and that long can stand out in really big ways and get his hands on footballs and things like that. And he did that. Lots of credit to him. But it clearly hasn't materialized into anything over the course of the last few years with, he, like Kelvin Joseph before him, just could not, regardless of the injury situations or all that kind of stuff, find a way to crack significant playing time on the roster. And when he did get the opportunity, didn't do anything to hold on to it at all.
In Wright's defense, if he was picked at the position where he should have picked, which is probably where like Farniok or Mamu were picked, I would say he was a good 6th, 7th round pick.
Yes.
He's provided depth. He's played special teams. He's been not terrible when he's in, and stuff like that. But when you get picked and you get picked so much above where you should have in the 3rd round, it's difficult. He hasn't lived up to those kind of expectations, but honestly, it's not really his fault. He shouldn't have had those expectations really in the first place. When you go and watch his tape at Oregon State, he was someone who played exclusively, and I mean exclusively, cover 3, bail coverage. That was all he did. And the fact that he went to Dan Quinn's system, which in today's modern NFL is probably the closest thing that you're going to get to what he did in college.
Maybe Gus Bradley might be the only guy doing more of it,
and the fact that he still wasn't able to crack a starting lineup or get a significant role on defense, I think that shows kind of where he was as a player and who he is as a player. And unfortunately, I don't think he has much upside in a Zimmer's defense where their Rolodex of calls is going to be much more numerous.
Yeah, and now, to be fair to Nahshon, he has been extremely valuable on special teams. But again, like you said, if he gets picked at 192 overall, where the Cowboys took Quentin Bohanna, we're talking about what a great 6th round pick. He's contributed some huge plays on special teams, hasn't really cracked the lineup as a cornerback, but maybe there was a lot of development that needed to take place there. We knew that. But when you take somebody in the top 100 picks and through 3 years they have done nothing, it's a rough situation for Nahshon and for the Cowboys defense and the front office and all this kind of thing. And this is really kind of a tough period of this draft for like a solid 100 picks, where the Cowboys just had a ton of shots at the apple, and it just felt like, or feels like now looking back on it, you can look at it, they just missed and missed and missed and missed and missed. And the one guy who we kind of all felt like coming out of the draft, it's like, oh, what a steal. There's a whole lot of studies being done now on how the players we feel like are steals coming out of the draft are very rarely steals, and there's 2 or 3 of them in this Cowboys draft class that are evidence of that, and Kelvin Joseph and Jabril Cox. But they took Jabril Cox at 115. Everybody thought he was like a second, third round player. He goes in the 4th round. We're all jacked up and excited. He gets a little bit of opportunity. Jalen Smith gets released to give him more opportunity on the field in 2021. He makes, I will never forget, I think it was the 4th and goal tackle at like the 2-yard line to save a touchdown or a 2-point conversion or something like that. That tackle tears his ACL, and as you said earlier, the rest is history. Like, he did almost nothing else in his time with the Cowboys, and
he is the biggest probably what if in this draft class, because I wonder if he didn't tear that ACL, what would have happened? Because I mean, when he was coming back from the ACL, what did everybody say? He doesn't look like he has the same speed. He doesn't look like he has the same confidence in his movement abilities. And those are the things you really drafted him on. When he was at LSU and when he was at North Dakota State, his coverage ability was one of the most impressive that I've seen from a second level player in recent draft. I mean, I still have the clips on my computer where he's covering receivers 40 yards downfield and making pass breakups. He's running with tight ends across the field. He's blanketing running backs on wheel routes. He was just such a versatile and promising coverage linebacker that when you look at what the NFL is becoming today with the RPO game, how much they're trying to attack the middle of the field with short to intermediate routes, mesh routes, all these different situations that, like we said earlier, that offensive coordinators are trying to put these second level defenders in conflict. Jabril Cox coming out of college was almost like the perfect fit for that, but he had injury concerns coming out of college. That's why he fell to the 4th round. And then we saw the torn ACL, and it was history. It was just so unfortunate. I still in my loins feel like if that torn ACL never happened, I think he's a starting linebacker for the Cowboys today. I think he's one of the 2.
Yeah, he was definitely on that trajectory. If he was going to become that as a 4th round pick, the trajectory that he took for the first 6 months he was on the Cowboys roster is exactly the trajectory that you would want to see. And then it all got derailed by that knee, and who knows what comes after that.
Let's be honest. This was a guy who went from, as all the things we said about him, by the end of his tenure, he got passed up by guys like Malik Jefferson. He was getting passed up by guys who couldn't hold his jock strap at the beginning.
Yes, absolutely.
It just shows how much these injuries can really hinder a player's play and kind of make him almost unrecognizable.
Yes, absolutely. And it's one of those things that makes, we like to assume, especially ACLs. And now the thing about the ACLs, we don't always know about the surgery and the recovery and all this other kind of stuff. But we just kind of assume, guy tore an ACL, he'll be out 11 months, he'll come back next year, he'll be fine. 18 months later, he'll be back to exactly who he was. And that just never materialized for Jabril Cox. And a guy who was really, like you said, kind of the skeleton key kind of player for especially, Dan Quinn played as much or more cover one, more man coverage than pretty much anybody else in the league over the last 2 years. And if you plug a linebacker in with the man coverage capability that Jabril Cox showed coming out of school, like that's really a difference-making type player at a position that normally is a little bit lower value and easier to attack and all those kinds of things. That's kind of a difference-making player that just never really materialized. And I think to make both of ourselves feel better about the evaluation we had on him coming out, we'll blame it on the injury, but I don't know there. We'll see. Then we get to Josh Ball, and there's all the Josh Ball is a really hard conversation.
This was like one of those picks where it was almost like unitedly panned across the entire Cowboys thing because of all the off-field issues, like really, really bad off-field issues he had coming out of, what was it, Marshall?
Yeah.
And since he's gotten into the NFL, he's been terrible. So
he's been hurt, and when he hasn't been hurt, he's been bad. Yeah. And so that's the story of Josh Ball. He's a player that pretty much everybody who covers the Cowboys and does this kind of thing that we do about the Cowboys really kind of wish they didn't pick, because nobody wants to have these conversations, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we've had to have them several times over the last 2 years with guys that the Cowboys have had. But he just hasn't played. When he has played, he hasn't been good. He wasn't good enough at tackle, so they moved him to guard. He wasn't good enough at guard, and then he got hurt. And now we're going into year 4.
Cut season coming soon. Cut
Yeah.
season coming soon.
Yes, and it's like I don't know. He doesn't have a play. I'll be honest with you. I forgot he was still on the Cowboys roster. I had to go look up Josh Ball on Google. I have it on another tab on my computer right now to help me verify that he was still on the team.
Yeah.
That he was still on the roster, because I don't think there's a whole lot of conversation to be had about Josh Ball in 2024 other than the fact that he's probably not going to be on the roster. Then we get to Simi Fehoko, who just kind of, again, we get into these later rounds, and maybe we're better off talking about Simi Fehoko, Quentin Bahana, kind of in the same bucket of guys who hung around for a while, had a little bit of a role, never really took huge advantage of their role, of their opportunities, and now they're not with the team.
And he didn't do anything with the Cowboys. Obviously, he had 2 years here. He couldn't really carve out a role. He's one of those guys who was the height, weight, speed guy. He's the guy that had, he's tall, he's really fast, he has good hands, good body control, and you think this is something we're going to be able to develop, but it just hasn't really worked out in that way. I mean, he's shown some flashes a little bit more with the Chargers. Especially I think in the preseason, he had some good performances that earned his way onto the 53-man roster. But I mean, it's a 5th round pick. I'm not going to get mad at him for it. I mean, even though it didn't work out, these are the type of swings that I like to see on day 3, height, weight, speed, take the big, good athletes, and hopefully you can develop him. And just, unfortunately, he wasn't one to develop for whatever reason may be. But I'm not going to be upset about the Cowboys. I'm actually happy they took this kind of swing at this kind of player, and I think it's something that they should continue to do moving forward.
Yes, absolutely. The height, weight, speed guy who has some experience playing special teams, who, because of that special teams, has a little bit of some grit and some hard-nosedness about him. That's exactly the kind of player you want to take at a wide receiver at pick 179 overall. Then a few picks later, they take Quentin Bahana, and I think we were all pretty excited about them taking Quentin Bahana just because that was a completely different kind of player than anybody the Cowboys have picked in years. And I don't remember the exact dimensions, but I remember him being 6'3", 350 pounds or something like that. Basically, big, sloppy, we'll call it is, big, sloppy, fat defensive interior player.
Honestly, he reminds me a lot, he reminds me a little bit of Justin Rogers, who was drafted this year. Kind of a really big space eater who, when he would have backfield production, it was kind of as that. They weren't really he's not the quickest player, but he was quick enough to surprise guards and centers on occasion and be able to knife into the backfield and make some plays. But unfortunately, wasn't able to. Another guy who just really failed to develop with the Cowboys.
Yeah, and if I remember right with Bahana, it was kind of funny because he was this big, huge, sloppy nose tackle who played like a much smaller player, in the style he was trying to penetrate gaps, trying to get off of guys' shoulders, play half a man instead of playing head up, all these kind of things, as this big, huge body type. And so it looked really exciting. It's hey, if this guy can move like this, if we can, he's big enough, he should be able to play against the run pretty well if we can, get him to take on the blocks up front, just based on his size. If he can play like this, maybe he's got some pass rush upside. And that's kind of what got people excited about him, I think, was the way he played for the size that he had, even if it, didn't materialize into what we kind of hoped or what his, top end outcome would have been in the NFL for sure.
Yeah, I really don't have anything to add on him. I know he was with the Lions. I think not really sure how well he did over there, but I don't think the Cowboys really miss him. I don't think he was doing much, and I don't think the biggest thing you need from a nose tackle to be able to do is to make life easier on the linebackers, and Bohanna consistently made life more difficult on the linebackers when he was in. So it was, meh.
Yep, that's pretty much where I am too. Then we get to Israel Mukuamu is, one of these very, very confusing players for me. We've had this conversation about Israel on this show. I've had it in other places too. Is that like when he has played, all he's done is be super effective and super productive. And whether it's at slot corner, whether he's had to play outside, whether he's had to play true safety, whether he's played kind of box player, kind of second level defender kind of player, all he's done is be really effective. And yet, for some reason, they just continue to move things around to keep him from having like a real big major role in the defense. And it's something that I don't necessarily understand, but it's the way that they've played things out over the course of the last few years, where like they have tried to force Nashawn Wright onto the field, who is probably a lesser version of the same player type ideal, like big, long defensive player, defensive back who can cover guys and shorten up these windows. And Mukuamu has been way better at that than these other guys, and he's gotten way less opportunity.
This is one of those situations where I know you and those of us who have a lot of experience, on covering quote unquote teams and really like watching like closely about what the teams, the press conferences and everything, and evaluating players play, how players play and all those different things. When these type of situations happen, when there's a guy who's clearly more talented than the role he has been given over multiple years, there's something going on behind the scenes, whether it's the coaches don't trust him in for his knowledge of the defense, for being assignment sound, those type of things, or his personality conflicts with the coaching staff, or there has to be something going on, because there's no reason why someone with his size, athleticism, and talent and on-field ability that we've actually seen, it's not like it's just practice or training camp. We've seen him in actual game time action make big plays. So there has to be something going on behind the scenes. I don't want to speculate as to what that is exactly. Could be a million different things, but there's definitely got to be something going on behind the scenes for sure.
Yeah, the thing is, at least personally, I don't feel like it can be the trust thing, because I look back at 2022, I think it was. They go through all these injuries at corner at the end of the year, and they're kind of sat there stuck, and they're signing guys off the street because Kelvin Joseph couldn't play and all these other kind of things. And then their answer for the playoffs was, hey, let's take Israel Mukuamu and let's plug him at slot, and let's put Deron Bland outside, and that's how we'll play defense in the playoffs. And the defense was much better those 2 games in the playoffs than they had been the 4 or 5 games leading up to that point after all the injuries. So it's like they came up with that answer for the most important games of the season that year, and it worked really well. And then they just went away from it, and maybe it was just out of necessity that they felt like it was their only option at that point was to do that. And so there's still the trust stuff and all that other kind of stuff. But like you said, who knows? Could be a million things. We get to the Cowboys' last pick of the draft.
Farniok, let's go.
Farniok, yes. And this is funny because I don't know that I've ever heard a 7th round pick who has basically not played at all. Injured, been hurt a ton, came into the league hurt, was hurt his rookie year, been hurt since, and yet for some reason, every time you talk about the offensive line with these guys, they bring up Matt Farniok's name. And,
he is kind of the Brock Hoffman before Brock Hoffman.
Yeah,
the guy
yes.
The weight room warrior who was always there, who the teammates loved, the coaching staff loved because of his temperament and his ability. I remember he got in on a game 16, or I forget. I think it was the last game of the season.
Yeah.
It was 2022, was it? And he had 3 pancake blocks against, obviously the other team was playing their 3rd stringers as well. And he looked honestly like a pretty competent interior offensive lineman against other incompetent interior defensive linemen. Not just the buzz. I mean, every time I talk to, my quote unquote sources, they were just gush about Farniok, and especially the offensive line people. They were just saying this is a guy who's going to be someone who's going to be here for a while. He's going to be someone who can develop into a starter. He's smart. He works hard. He has that grit, all of that. And then Brock Hoffman took everything he ever wanted.
Yep, absolutely. And to be totally honest, I was reading Matt Farniok's name, and I was thinking of Matt Waletzko whenever I was talking about the way that they talk about him. But the story is similar with Farniok, like you said, where that first offseason, Farniok was coming for Tyler Biadasz's job going into 2022. Like, that was the story. That was the way it was playing out. He was the hardest worker. He was all this stuff. And he was going to be the guy going into the year that, like, could jump up and take one of these jobs on the interior that nobody was expecting. And it just never materialized because, a lot like the guy you talked about who he was before he was, he's not really a real life NFL player. And so because of that, when you're not a real life NFL player, the league figures that out pretty quick, and you become what you are, and that's either a real bottom of the depth chart depth guy or a guy who's not in the league very much for any sort of continued period of time. So that's the Cowboys 2021 draft class. John, I'm going to ask you to do something. I didn't tell you I was going to do this.
Uh-oh.
What do you think grade-wise, now that we look back after 3 years? We always talk about, let's wait 3 years before we grade this draft. 3 years in, what do you think about this draft? What's your grade here? Cowboys picked 11 players. This is the way you should draft, right? Pick as many players as you can. What do you think about the class as a whole? Give me a grade.
I would have to give it a solid B to B. I don't want to, B, because I don't think it's ready for a B plus. But obviously, first round pick Micah Parsons, A plus. Can't be mad at it. When you finish second in the Defensive Player of the Year voting every year you've been in the NFL, pretty dang good. Dang good. And then you go, obviously, second round, Kelvin Joseph, F. Just didn't contribute anything. I guess a D, because there was that 1 year he was pretty good on special teams as a gunner.
Yeah.
So him and CJ Goodwin were really good in tandem together. So I guess you can a D minus, something like that. And then third round, I think the third round was a good B plus, because you did get Osa, you did get Golston, who were both. Osa, like we've said, is on a trajectory to be one of the upper defensive tackles in the league. And then you got Golston, who's a very solid rotational presence in the interior and edge defender groups. And then Deshaun Wright, that's the one that's kind of the bad pick of the three. And then day three is the one that's tough, because you got to give, the fact that Israel Mukwamu is the only guy that really is the only guy that has shown any value whatsoever, that really kind of, I would say, tanks the grade a little bit. So maybe even a B minus, I would say. Now that I'm talking through it, I would say a B minus. Maybe if you wanted to weight the first rounder so much, because it's such how valuable that first round pick is and how much you have to nail it, maybe you can bump it up. But if you're just looking at them all in totality, I would say B minus-ish. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's probably the right range. And, I think it's part of it's clouded because there are so many misses because they took so many picks.
Mm-hmm.
But, you get, like you said, one of the, if not the best defensive player in the entire NFL. There's all the, I want to be a leader, and then I don't show up for OTAs. I do my own thing. That's a whole separate conversation. 2-time first team All-Pro, 3-time top 2 or 3 vote getter in the Defensive Player of the Year. Just phenomenal player. You add Osa Odigizua to that, you have 2 really solid starters or better at 2 pretty important positions. Then you have Chauncey Golston and Israel Mukwamu, who have been very important depth pieces, who have played really important roles in different games throughout the careers. It really feels like one more, if Jabril Cox doesn't tear his ACL, then he's a starting linebacker for this team. And they didn't have to draft Marvion Overshown last year because of the fact that Jabril Cox was that guy for this team already. This is probably an A draft. You get 3 really, really good starters and 2 or 3 depth pieces out of a draft. That's probably an A draft. As it is, I think you're probably right. It's probably on a whole a B minus-ish draft, B to B minus, just because there was so many missed opportunities. The Kelvin Joseph pick, he was kind of seen as the last of
personally, it's really hard to give someone an A when you don't nail the first and the second. I think the B and A, you have to nail the top two for sure, because those are just so much more valuable. We've seen, from the studies, how much more valuable the first and second round picks are compared to 3 through down. So I think if they would have nailed that Joseph pick, it almost would have been an A regardless of who else was there. Yeah. But unfortunately, they did not.
Yep, absolutely. All right, we are going to get out of here, guys. We are going to get to, we've had so many things pop up. We're lucky it's the off season, so we can afford for these things to pop up right now on us. Whether it's internet issues on my end or, mouth issues with John's Brazilian jiu-jitsu knocking his teeth out. But we got lots of fun stuff planned for this next month and a half. And then John is going to spend some time at camp. So we're going to get some insight from training camp that, and if you know the kind of insight that usually comes out of training camp from a lot of people who watch the training camp practices,
you're going to get me ranting again. You're going to get me on the rant.
There is a different level of insight that's going to come from John Owning sitting at a training camp practice than is going to come from insert your Cowboys beat writer here. So just remember that. Come here through camp, through that couple of weeks of camp, to make sure that you get the best insight that you can get into what's going on in Oxnard, as Jerry would say. We're going to get to, like I talked about last week, some of these film reviews. We're going to look at a couple of games. John and I got to really nail down what games we want to look at. And we'll go through that process. It's going to be fun over the course of the next 6 weeks. And then we get into camp, and then this thing just takes off, and it feels like it, just goes nonstop because it really does go nonstop for 6 or 7 months. So we're excited, guys. Thank you guys so much for joining us. If you're watching on the replay, thanks for watching us on the replay. If you're a business owner, this show is sponsored by Silver Moon Financial. My company. I help small business owners who suck at accounting, suck less at accounting, whether it's because I do it for them or because I help them learn how to do it. So there's a link in the description to the video below. Check that out if you don't mind. If you suck at accounting, there's a guide to QuickBooks Online that can help you be better. So again, this is John. I'm Joey. Thanks so much for joining us. We will see you guys next week.